So since we are an international group and maybe some of us haven't met before, I wanted to share with you a little bit about me, where I come from, how I was trained, and about this book. It's been with me for a long time. So I was born in New South Wales, Australia. My father's Australian. My mom is American from Billings, Montana. So we moved back when I was a little girl, and that's where I grew up. I was recruited as a national merit finalist to do my undergraduate work at the University of Oklahoma. So I studied the liberal arts, right? History, literature, philosophy, did a minor in medical humanities, and then did all this science pre-work to potentially go on and be a dietitian. I was interested in that intersection of nutrition and health and culture from the very beginning. And so the roots of this book are in my honors thesis that I did when I was 20 and 21 years old, thinking about the diet culture and the diet language that surrounded me. And so there are, the beginnings of this from that early work. And so at that moment in my life, I wasn't sure, right? Was I allowed to write papers? Was that a way to, contribute something wonderful to the world? I was worried I needed to do more and be in the trenches. So I went to public health school at UC Berkeley, focusing on public health nutrition, on, population level nutrition interventions and policy, of the hope, right, of what role could not just food and fitness, but also managing our finances, managing our stress, incorporating our families into, our entire way of thinking about health, that could be a part of how we make the world a better place. And so I put that training to use at Kaiser Permanente, which is a incredible integrated healthcare system here in the United States. It was a wonderful place to work, but while I was there doing what I had been trained to do in public health, I realized I wasn't cut out for being in a cubicle every day, and I missed working with students. I had gotten to teach Introduction to Nutrition, every single semester as a graduate instructor when I was at Berkeley, and I really valued and loved that experience. So I went back to school, this time for a master's in gastronomy and food studies from Boston University. This is the program that was founded by Julia Child and Jacques Pepin for the serious study of food in the academy. And so this was an amazing jumping off point to continue my research on dieting, expanding it to think about men and masculinities, and to be really rooted in food studies. And then for my doctoral work, I went to Brown University, getting a PhD in American Studies, bringing together the study of American culture, American society, American politics, and then my work, right, still thinking about food, health, bodies, and identities. And then the space that I've been interested in seeing where those circulate is in media, in popular culture. So I was lucky in the constantly, continually difficult academic job market that I did land a job at the University of Tulsa in media studies. This is my third year here. And it's interesting, right, to be in media studies. I'm so honored to be here with a group of sociologists. I'm so indebted to sociological theory and how I think about gender, and so many of the amazing sociologists working on food in particular. And so I've loved finding this new home in media studies in a really unique department that thinks food studies is media studies, that food is a medium that connects us, that provides space for communication, for contestation, for resistance. And so thinking again about where are these interdisciplinary spaces where the study of food can really thrive and open up new questions. So those are always conversations that I'm interested in having. But as we dive into the book, I'll start with dudes. What do I mean when I talk about dudes? So most people think of the dude, right? If you've seen The Big Lebowski, this incredible 1998 film from Joel and Ethan Coen, you have this pop culture figure in your head. And so one way that I think about it, right, is that while the social definitions of masculinity and manhood require, right, that this quote unquote real man works and competes, triumphs and provides, the dude abides, right? He slacks off. He isn't aspiring to all of these standards. So I'm working with the dude as a specific gender discourse, as a particular type of masculinity. And it's one that is cool. It is unserious. It is purposefully ironic in the way that the dude is celebrating the slacker. This is about holding up the average or even below average guy as the dude resists these demands of manhood, like competitiveness and breadwinning, instead relaxing and opting out. So it provides some flexibility for some men who already hold a considerable amount of power in society to navigate masculinity in a different and more flexible way. But at the same time, the dude remains wholly complicit in hegemonic masculinity, drawing here from Connell's foundational work and how we think about dominant forms of masculinity in a particular time at a particular place. And so the dude is a sort of hybrid masculinity, and that it still is complicit in and benefits from this overall structure of power and inequality that hegemonic masculinity and patriarchy make possible, but he can slack through it, right? There's some benefit for a sector of men, but it's doing nothing to dismantle, right, broader systems of inequity. And so while the dude is applicable to multiple identities, there are female dudes, there are Black dudes, right? We can think about this with different demographics and different groups, but the dude primarily connotes a sense of masculinity that's inherently white. Right? While this is about upholding the power of a straight masculinity, it's also tied up in that white supremacist impetus to hold up that particular structure of power, that the dude operates in those ways as it's holding up these sort of dominant systems of power. As we think about whiteness, as we think about heteronormativity and heterosexuality, as we think about cisgender, youthful, able-bodiedness, that these are sort of the various ways, right, that the dude is primarily understood as a gender discourse. But it also has a longer history. So dude in the United States starts to appear in the 19th century, at first referring to fastidiously well-dressed urban men, and then later to dude ranches, these spaces where men of means would escape from the city and from modernity, right, to recapture this supposed natural masculinity of the West in these moments where there's this concern that particularly white masculinity, right, is fading away with the rise of consumer culture and industrial capitalism and these different ways of being and moving through the world. The dude was a way of combating a different moment of gender crisis in the 19th century. By the 1930s and 1940s, we see urban, fashion-conscious African-American and Mexican-American men using the dude to refer to one another in a way that contrasted with this white, affluent dandy. And then in the 1950s, the dude becomes synonymous with guy, as white culture appropriated dude, along with words like groovy and cool, particularly from Black culture. So there is this element of sort of cultural appropriation that goes with dude as well. In the 60s and 70s, we see particular surfer and druggy subcultures adopt dude as a countercultural form of resistance, which goes even further in the 1980s as the dude rebels against, the yuppie consumerism of that decade. And in the 1990s becomes this way to really lean in and express that nihilism of that decade as well. And this is the moment where we see these dude films, right? Like The Big Lebowski, but also things like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which was just rebooted again last year. So we think about how these dude tropes continue to circulate, as well as films, right, like Clerks, or Dude, Where's My Car, right? So even these phrases of how we use dude, how it functions into sentences and questions, that they become, right, sort of ingrained in popular culture. So the moment where I'm really interested in studying the dude is this 21st century shift, that even though the dude was never a dominant gender discourse during this time, he reemerges during this significant social upheaval of the new millennium, when multiple changes and factors were colliding in a way that destabilized white masculinity and could be characterized as a sort of long moment of gender crisis as we think about this turn into the 21st century. So the year 2000 is where we reach a new threshold of married women being the breadwinners in their families, the same year that married women's educational attainment surpasses that of their husbands. In 2000, the United States, we elect George W. Bush in part as the beer test president, right? The candidate that most voters would want to have a beer with and get to know and have in the White House. Who then exercised a specific brand of cowboy diplomacy following 9/11, thinking about the Homeland Security Act, thinking about very different ways of codifying terrorism, of thinking about American borders and boundaries, and a sort of geopolitical sense of status and control in a larger ongoing war on terror. And then these sort of collide with new and different changes, right? Also destabilizing white masculinity as we move into the Obama era. The hope, right, that with electing a Black president, the United States had entered into this post-racial moment when nothing could have proven to be further from the truth, as our moment right now, confirms irrefutably. And then also things as we think about sexualities, right? Repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, as we think about LGBTQ folks in the military, repealing the Defense of Marriage Act, as we think about who has the right under the law to get married, and things like the DREAM executive action of pathways to citizenship, of thinking about immigration, borders, again, this defining of the United States. All of this creating a context that's destabilizing this prowess of white masculinity. And you'll see I've left something out here in the middle of the Great Recession, right, which economically is sort of defined by this 2007 to 2009 moment. But I write in the book about the Great Recession era, a time where this stretches far beyond 2009, as we think about how that economic moment had social and cultural impacts. And so the dude expanded under the conditions of the Great Recession, which economists and cultural critics alike called the he session, or a man session, for the more significant job loss among men during that recession. In the recession we're living through right now, we are seeing far more significant job loss for women, and particularly women of color. But for this one, this was a moment that for masculinity in particular, right, to not have a job, to not be able to provide for your family, to perhaps be a millennial younger man who can't start your career, you have to move home and live with your parents, that this is a significant economic event with cultural implications for how men could be men. And so the aspirational sort of conventions of masculinity are always out of reach, but the recession made them even more so. And so when we think about food and food labor, these were moments perhaps where some men were home, under or unemployed, and performing a different amount of food labor, and having to sort of renegotiate some of them with this more conventional understanding of masculinity and food work. And so that's one piece of this puzzle as we think about the recession. But if you're sitting there wondering, what does the dude have to do with food? Like, thank you for your definitions and your history, but like, when are we getting to the food? So what I'm looking at in this book is how the food media and marketing industries manipulated the dude in order to sell what were perceived to be feminized food and figures to men. And I'm focusing on this moment from about 2000 to 2020. And so they built their strategies, right? How are they going to sell feminized figures? They did it by building upon the wholly masculine precedents set by a specific food genre. This is where dude food comes into the story. So I didn't know that the cover of my book was going to end up being a burger, but it couldn't be more perfect in how it sort of articulates on this symbolic level some of the arguments that the book is making about gender, food, and power. And interestingly enough, every outlet that has covered my book, these are the images that they pick, right? They are always big burgers. And then in half of them, right, we see that the person eating the burger is also a white man, right? That this is the level of symbolism as we think about what dude food is, why it matters, how it is sort of animated in this book. And so an example that I often bring is this exceptional burger from the Burger's Priest, which has locations throughout Canada, which they call the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse burger. So that even from that naming convention, right, this is something that is coming for you, right, that might bring danger. That this is not just a hamburger, right? Like, we've got multiple patties, we've got multiple fried onion rings, and we do not have buns, we have grilled cheese sandwiches instead. So there's this huge level of exaggeration, right? This is so much beyond just the cheeseburger that we might order when we go out to eat sometimes. And so here are some other examples. Things like nacho fries crack me up. These have been very popular at Taco Bell, a fast food Mexican restaurant in the United States. And they've also found their way onto a number of restaurant menus of these loaded fries with tons and tons of stuff on top of them. Hot wings I've written about as well, right? These chicken wings that are dressed in very, very hot sauces, right? The hotter the better, the opportunity to prove your masculinity, to triumph over pain, and to be able to eat your way through it. I write about Trashcan Nachos in my chapter on Guy Fieri. I love the naming here of trash, right? We are pushing back against ideas of, what is grotesque, what is edible, what is socially acceptable. And so the way that these are dressed, they're all mixed up in a can, and then it's served tableside, where they pull the can upward and these nachos just vomit out the bottom of it. And so it's this performance of the grotesque, of the exaggerated. And so those are one of my favorites to think about. Just like Dude, Where's My Car, the film, this is the Dude, Where's My Hot Dog from Las Vegas, right? So heavily dressed with toppings, we can't even really see the meat. And then of course, bacon, right? Bacon added to anything is one of these tropes that we see with dude food. This bacon weave taco, right? Which also has a layer of mac and cheese before we get to the taco. These multiple layers of exaggeration of how we see dude food set onto the plate. And with the burgers, the Trashcan Nachos, even these meatballs, I've also been co-editing with a colleague, Xenia Quiche, this collection on food and Instagram. And so thinking about how dude food pushes back against that Instagram aesthetic of the beautifully lit, styled overhead flat lay shot, that dude food is meant to be photographed from the side, right? To show this full girth and expansiveness, the height, right, of what's being put onto the plate. That it's pushing back against a number of food trends, one of them being aesthetic. So if we think about, right, what is dude food really, and why does it keep showing up when anyone writes about my book? So one thing we see is meat, right? Literally, we see meat as an ingredient show up in most of these dishes that we consider dude food, but there's also this symbolic level, building, of course, upon Carol J. Adams' amazing, work of feminist eco-criticism, thinking about this interrelationship of eating meat to construct and produce masculinity, but also the interrelated subordination of both women and animals in that effort. That meat tells us so much about how power is organized in society, how we can also see it, right, on restaurant menus, in Instagram, in all of these other food media spaces. But even beyond, right, the literal presence and symbolic potential of meat, I came to define dude food as comfort food with an edge of competitive destruction. So with comfort food, right, they're foods that we do like and that we turn to, and that, nutritionally maybe have more fat or more carbohydrate, that it makes us feel good within our bodies. Maybe there's a nostalgic element. But this edge of competitive destruction is where the expectations of masculinity, right, reveal their sharpness. That many of these dishes, if you ate them, right, you would have a tummy ache. You might have trouble the next day with gastrointestinal distress, right? Like these would be foods that you have to triumph over to be able to actually eat. There's an article that I cite in the book that was in a men's magazine, that was critiquing dude food and how it's advertised to men, of this argument, right, that the challenge is, are you man enough to eat this shit, right? Like, are you man enough, and will you eat this food that isn't particularly good in some of the ways that we think about what good food is and why it matters? So there's this edge, right, of the competitive destruction that plays out in a couple of ways. We've talked about full throttle flavor, right? So spicy, so salty, so cheesy, right? Is it even still, gastronomically well balanced and delightful to eat? The portion sizes being so large, so exaggerated, that when we think about both food waste and the discomfort of eating all of it, that there is this ambivalence inherent to that. Dude food also has a really fascinating class politics as we think about the mostly very unfussy and anti-elitist presentations, right? These are often on very simple white crockery dishes. There are no tweezers, right, being used to plate dude food, right? It's slapped on and then meant to be consumed, that it has that element to it as well. And then thinking about nutrition and health and resistance, there is this purposeful nutritional risk-taking and this enthusiastic excess that feeds into both the perhaps quite detrimental sort of conventions of masculinity that view health and sort of health promoting behaviors as sort of feminine and feminizing, but also this power to sort of push back and do whatever you want. As we think about how that pushes back against sort of government dietary advice or dominant health trends, that there's a pushing back against the Instagrammability, of pushing back against the broader health and wellness trends, that dude food is trying and does do something different. So interestingly, when we think about context, dude food's popularity exactly mirrors the rise of dude as a gender discourse that I'm studying. A friend also told me bacon weave follows this exact same pattern. So it's fascinating to be able to use, Google Books' Ngram Viewer to see, when these terms are being used and published in books to be able to track some of their historical trends and specificity. But I argue that there's more to dude food than even just defining what it is as a food genre or as a food trend. That dude food embodies this ironic playfulness of the dude as a gender discourse and the privilege inherent to that. It still has this confidence, this fearless freedom, and all of that privilege that the dude has to be able to eat and by extension do and be whatever he wants, while others around him, right, are not given that same purchase. And so eating and living like a dude comes with a set of anxieties, risks, and consequences. When we think about individual and population health, when we think about food waste, and when we think about the logics of dude food feeding into a way of eating that contributes to existing inequities in food systems of who has enough to eat, of who gets to eat whatever they want and who's just scraping by, that dude food still operates on these same sort of systems of privilege as the dude himself, in not dismantling or moving forward in any sort of sense of way of sort of inclusion or equity. And so a number of brands, right, took these conventions of the dude and dude food and applied them to their products. So Velveeta Shells and Cheese is like a microwave cheesy pasta dish that had mostly marketed to women, as a quick, convenient dinner. But in this moment that I'm studying, they decide to go after the dude, and their campaign is eat like that guy right? And so it's a guy who has done something that is this like slacker success, right? So this guy put a skylight in his bedroom last year, and it's looking pretty good, right? Like it's this humorous, ironic, winking, silly accomplishment. Other ones were celebrating a man who worked at a mall at a kiosk selling remote control helicopters, right? This dude gets paid to play, right? Like let's celebrate him. Other examples, Kentucky Fried Chicken did a funny survey that their dude food etiquette included, right, that you don't double dip, that you don't eat food off the floor, right, that there's sort of this play on acceptability, on how you should conduct yourself, aligning with the dude. These are from Oscar Mayer. They're portable protein packs. They play off of the popularity of Kraft's Lunchables, which are these sort of little finger food things that are really popular for children. And so this is bringing that sort of resisting adulthood and responsibility and childlike play to a protein-filled, right, snack for adults. Not just for men, of course, but looking at the packaging choices, the way we're talking about protein, that we can see how it was target marketed as well. And a final example that I'll bring for you are Devour frozen meals. So Kraft Heinz had for a long time been making very low-calorie frozen meals for women on Weight Watchers, and they switched gears, right? And they're like, let's go after men in the frozen food aisle. And so they do it with comfort food, right? We already talked about nacho fries, right? So it's dishes like that that have, much higher calorie profiles than some of what they've been producing. And we see, again, right, Black colors, right? All the ways that they're working to sort of code masculinity in the packaging and in the food that they're offering. But what's interesting is that Devour's launch commercial and a Super Bowl commercial, right, which would have cost more than $5 million for 30 seconds to air during the NFL football game, they play in much more sort of insidious ways with misogynistic threads. Their launch commercial was called Lunch Spank. There's a man who works in an auto body shop, and he's microwaved his meal, and he's talking dirty to it like you would to a lover. And then at the end, he literally like spanks it with his fork. Like it's so off the wall of how they're trying to say like men can, microwave their food, right? Like it's food that you want to triumph over the same way that you would a woman. And the Super Bowl commercial played on the concept of food porn, but applying it in a way that's much more similar to sort of sexual pornography than sort of the way that food porn operates, you know, in a slightly different space. That their pitch there was that it was a man who'd been addicted to food porn. He was addicted to Devour, to the extent, right, that it was impacting his relationship and his life. So there's this edge of irony and humor, but the jokes often don't land when we view them through a feminist lens, when we see the ongoing sort of misogyny in the messaging. And so it's interesting too that the OnlyFriends social media platform is a space where Vice has taken their Munchies vertical, and it's all about food porn. So thinking about how sex work and food porn coming together in these very complicated ways that aren't really being interrogated or thinking about what those dynamics are. So these were foods that didn't have to deal with a perception of feminization, right? They were foods that could use the dude as they targeted to men. But what I'm interested in as the book is one step more complicated, and that I'm interested in what marketers call gender contamination, which is defined as consumer resistance to brand gender bending. So this can go in a couple of ways. It can be perceived as empowering for women to adopt a masculine brand, but it's perceived as disempowering for men to adopt a feminine brand or even a feminine product or category. So two of the foods that I look at in the book are diet sodas, which had been considered straight up lady drinks, right? That these were for women in their style, in their taste, in the way they're marketed. And same with yogurt. I know elsewhere in Europe, yogurt doesn't have this connotation, but in the United States, like yogurt was for women for a very long time. And you can see things like the packaging for Dan Enlightened Fit, right? It's purple and pink as these sort of scripty fonts. For a long time, this is how these products were marketed. And so when they go for men, right, we see black colors coming in. We see totally different sort of topography and sort of the style of how things are packaged, that they're trying to overcome this perception of gender contamination, that it is okay to drink diet soda and to eat yogurt. This powerful yogurt is my favorite. You can see on the side, there are literally 6-pack abs chiseled into the side of every plastic yogurt cup. The idea that you too can have a 6-pack, right? That like the yogurt will help you, and that as a man, this is yogurt for you, right? This is not lady yogurt. And so I think that this concept of gender contamination, I think it serves the means of the market and marketers far more than it represents individual or even group perceptions of gender and who we are. But it still reveals how power is organized and controlled in society, particularly within patriarchal cultures like the United States, where we see power consolidate around masculinity, whiteness, and affluence. And so in the book, I'm looking at how these various industries, food, media, and marketing, manipulated the dude in order to thwart this gender contamination, to sell these food and figures that were perceived as feminine. So I start looking at cookbooks, right? How do you sell cookbooks to the everyday man? Part of it is through meat. Part of it is about stories of cavemen cooking over fire. Part of it is about using your ability to cook to seduce women, right? We see these tropes repeated over and over again. Then I looked at how do we get more men to watch food television, looking at the example of Guy Fieri and how he brought a very different dude chef persona to Food Network and to food television that has had significant polarizing reaction, that he has a huge fan base, but also elicits a lot of folks who really dislike what he's about. So he was fascinating and very fun to look at, right? The construction of the dude chef and how it resists these norms of masculinity, of food media celebrity, and of who a chef ought to be. Then we go to the diet sodas and yogurts, which I told you a tiny bit about, and then ending looking at commercial weight loss programs, which really culminates all of the themes from the earlier chapters of how did they combat ideas about appetite, about flavor, about particular foods, about how you look after your body, about how you conceive of health, how do we embody transformation or not as we think about weight loss for men. So I'll briefly emphasize that there is a specific call to action in the book as we think about the ongoing work of the marketing industry and of food media, right? Whether on Instagram or on websites or on food television, that brands have the power to reflect, repeat, and reinforce definitions of identity that are conventional or even regressive. And this book documents a very frustrating number of examples like that. I brought for you this image side by side, these videos that Weight Watchers online for women and for men had used to market their products. And so looking at how the woman, she's seamlessly transported from the grocery store to her home kitchen, where she is using tools to create a healthy meal, while the man, right, is grilling outdoors, and he's not following some recipe, right? He's just eating his favorite food, right? Porterhouse steak outdoors. So this expectation that men didn't have to change what they were doing. The message from Weight Watchers was truly that you were just going to eat dude food, right? And the weight was just going to fall off. It was a very different promise and expectation than it was for women. So while brands can do this kind of destructive work, they can also play a part in the cultural work of resignification, of opening up possibilities of what gender is and can be and how we can talk about it. And so White Claw has been this really successful hard seltzer in the United States that purposefully launched with post-gender advertising. While other hard seltzers had cans or maybe had flowers and fruits, that they were going for more of a female audience, White Claw has been widely adopted and loved, everything from sort of soccer moms to frat boys. Everybody has not just enjoyed the product, but it's become a sort of cultural phenomenon. So thinking about where this idea of post-gender or gender neutral or not applying this gender binary to food and how we construct it and market it and talk about it, that there are opportunities for real market-driven change there. And so I, of course, believe that representation matters, and it matters deeply, and that is step one of how we can think about food and gender. But it's also about those next steps of access, right? To production, to seats at the table, positions of power, decision-making with equal pay. I was excited that this book came out at a moment where there is a big reckoning in food media in the United States, as we think about how it has been white and male in restaurants, how it has been mostly white in food writing, of how do we truly have a diverse, inclusive, and joyful food media scape, that these are sort of the directions that we're moving in. So just in case you're sitting there wondering why, something like the discourse of the dude matters, that it has these very real effects in how we see ourselves represented, and in, truly disturbing ways, right? With some of these images that I'm bringing for you from cookbooks, even this woman, right, lying in bed, half unclothed. This is from a cookbook for men, right? That this is how we market food, feeding, nurturing to men. That this is not a way that we move forward to have an equitable future. I also think that the dude was so useful for showing why food in particular, along with food media, remains such a fraught space for shaping and reflecting identities. The perceived fear of gender contamination was so much higher because we eat food. It comes into us, it becomes a part of ourselves, and physiologically, right, a part of us. And so a lot of these issues that we look at in other areas of consumer culture or in society are right on the surface with food, so we can excavate them that way. And so I really hope that this book and the stories that it tells about the dude and dude food reveal how power flows through media, through consumer culture, so that we can track it, right? So we can reconfigure it, so we can all move forward into a food culture and a food media future that's far more inclusive and diverse and just and joyful. So I will end there so that we have lots of times for comments and questions and discussion. I'll leave you with a few more bonkers images that I looked at as a part of this research. But thank you so much, and can't wait to hear what people think.
Thank you so much, Emily. Absolutely wonderful talk. So yeah, I've just been thinking of my own privilege during the talk, and also some of the rereadings I've been doing of Stuart Hall's work more recently on media theory, as he's a culturalist. What I want to do now is, we've got 20 or so minutes. Just this is out there to all participants. It's wonderful to see some very familiar names on the list. If you could field your questions, guys, in the chat, and I can then present them to Emily, and we will try and work through those as best as we can, guys. Is there anything else you would like to add, Julie, to that? Or
I really enjoyed that, Emily. Thank you. That was really fascinating, especially the gender aspects and masculinity, and how it continues to play out in terms of, you know, the way the way it's represented, and, you know, food porn and all of that sort of stuff. It was very reminiscent of a lot of the research that I did, you know, quite a few years ago now. So nothing changes much in these times sometimes. No. So if people could ask questions or make comments for Emily, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
I'm happy to start off. Sorry, the first one, Emily.
Sure.
So again, really fascinating of being kind of experiencing your work and observing your work from a distance, of course, and, you know, through social media. I've seen, and I just wanted to kind of ask you about you're kind of really interested to hear about your next kind of plan, or the next phase of your research, and how you plan on continuing to chip away in this very unique area, actually, where you've managed to kind of carve out some really good research.
No, I appreciate that. So there were a couple of things that couldn't fit into the book that were about food and gender that I've been working on. So I did a chapter about where this idea of like salads are feminine comes from and how that circulates in popular culture. I'm not sure if folks are aware, there was a really funny and frustrating photo essay in the Hairpin in 2011 called "Women Laughing Alone with Salad." And it's just a collating of all these really frustrating stock images of women eating these salads just like so happy, right? Like, they're these ridiculous images as we think about this idea that while men's appetites are perceived and sort of honored, right, to be voracious and to deserve to be filled and satisfied, that women are expected to perform lack and to actively pursue nothingness, right? That we're not supposed to take up physical space, that we're not supposed to have appetites for food or for sex. And so thinking about how all of those sort of come together. And so building on that sort of theorization, I was fascinated to look at how sort of the diet culture salad that has like negative calories of the 1990s and 2000s has turned into the wellnessified power bowl in our more current moment, right? That if you take the sort of salad components and mix them with a quote unquote ancient grain, and put in some protein, that there's this effort to sort of re-signify salads, to fill them up and sort of empower them. So I worked on that. And a couple of other pieces. I worked on one thinking about food on our 2020 US presidential campaign trail, thinking about how candidates perform themselves through the food that they eat as an attempt to show who they are, but also these sometimes misguided attempts to connect with the voting populace, given the fact that most everyone who runs for office here is at least class-based, right, significantly distant from the everyday voter. But the links in this book of thinking about fitness, about athletics, about sports, about gender, that the second book at this point is thinking about that intersection of food media and sports media. So really diving more into the Super Bowl, into the Olympics, and into thinking, where does this idea eat like an athlete come from, even for everyday people, right? That those are some of the ideas I'm playing with now.
Fantastic, Emily. Thank you so much. We've got a few questions coming in now. So, firstly, there's so are you? This is through the Q&A. Are you familiar with the soy boy phenomenon, the alt-right online space associating eating soy with becoming feminized, and by association, left-wing? I feel like this links into meat eating and dude food, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. I opened this book with a story about how when Luna Bar, it was this sort of meal replacement fitness bar for women, when it launched, there were all these fears from men of like, will it make me grow breasts, right? Will I turn into a woman if I eat this bar? And so we're seeing these interesting sort of panic around the Impossible Burger and all of these alternative meats of if it isn't meat, does it still, right, feed men and sort of perform this cultural work of masculinity? And then the political leanings of it is quite interesting too, in a way, right, that my country is still figuring out in a really dramatic moment. This protection of white masculinity, right? That it has been under threat throughout time, right? I agree with gender scholars who say that gender and masculinity in particular is always under crisis. But in thinking about the context in which white masculinity has been significantly destabilized and these reactionary forces that we're seeing, I argue that the dude is a reactionary force. He is different, thankfully, than sort of more deeply misogynist reactions like we see in incel culture, or exactly what you're referring to. But he is reacting to the same context, and is part and parcel of the same sort of moment as we think about what does food and gender tell us about these broader sociological changes. But I completely agree with you. Very, very related.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. Yes, moving on. A comment and question from Rebecca Wells. Fantastic talk. Thank you. I was wondering how you see this concept moving around the world. I can see dude food in the UK, but not perhaps as extreme as the examples you gave. Sorry.
Yeah, so I have seen examples in sort of similar Western countries, that I think Australia actually has a very strong dude food culture, of sort of exaggerated foods. When we were able to visit relatively recently, with milk in particular, which relates a little bit to the second book, right? The idea that there was a sports nutrition study showing that milk, particularly chocolate milk, was this perfect post-workout food that has the right amount of carb, fat, and protein, right, to sort of recuperate everything after you've done a really intense workout. And so you see the rise of all these like men's milks instead of children's milk or mother's milk, that there's this masculinization of milk. And so one of the products that we saw when we were in Australia had all this funny packaging of like how you should open up the carton, which is sort of like origami, right, where you're like pulling it open and getting it to work. But it had language, like bust it open here, like it was all this exaggerated masculine instruction to make sure that like milk was manly. There are a couple of advertising examples that I draw from the UK. In the example of Coke Zero, there was a campaign that ran in the UK that didn't run here, that was saying, the pitch was something like, Coke Zero is like all the goodness of Coke with none of the downsides. So why can't the rest of my life be like that, right? Like, why can't I have workmates without going to work? Why can't I have, a girlfriend without having to do all the work, right, of having a girlfriend? And so that one came from the UK. So I could see this discourse circulating in a same media space. And then similarly with Coke Zero, when it first launches in the United States, it's in like a white can, and it doesn't do well here. But in Australia and in sort of that whole Australasia region, they launched it in a black can as a tie-in with the All Blacks, the really successful rugby team, and it sells off the charts there. So that's when we get the black can in the UK and in Australia. So at least between those three countries, I've seen some of that going back and forth. But I also had friends who, further out in the UK, like I think Ireland, there were examples. I think in Nordic countries, they were even seeing some of this weird dairy milk masculinization. But a really good question as we think about, is the dude, as this sort of reactionary backlash playing out in food cultures all throughout Asia, or, in South America, would we see similar things? That I hope the dude as a particular kind of hybrid masculinity might be a useful tool to think in other places and to think through, other cultural forms beyond food and the body too.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing interesting observations, Emily. Another question from Nicole Pitter. I'm interested in vegetarian food and fake meat and how you've seen it is advertised to men. How do brands redo masculinity without meat?
Yes. So I think they're finding some of the same problems, right? Of how do you overcome the perceived feminization? Whether it's about how it's going to taste or how it's going to satisfy your appetite. And the idea that if it's not meat, right, how do we still have that cultural conversation about where protein and animal protein fits into the conversation? I've been really fascinated by how many products are coming out that have different kinds of plant protein, right? As we think about climate change, as we think about individual individual efforts as a part of sort of the future of the planet, we're seeing more and more options for what that plant-based protein can be. But I'm seeing in the United States, at least, this ongoing obsession with protein as a macronutrient that is read as masculine, that is read as a part of American exceptionalism to eat well, and that has this health halo, right? That we've been through low fat, we've been through low carb, like protein is this virtuous nutrient. And so it operates in this sort of nutritional imaginary in a really powerful way. And so thinking about even if protein becomes sort of divorced from the animal and is attached to these ideas of plant-based options, I still don't see a lot of those logics of power inherent to patriarchy, inherent to masculinity, really moving away. That the American diet isn't really thinking about, other ways of consuming protein and of changing our diets. It's still about substituting this exactly masculine, excessive, right, sort of right to protein. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. But there's been really interesting studies looking at, men adopting vegetarianism and veganism, how they're navigating themselves, how do they blog about it, how do they, chronicle it on Instagram, that there's really interesting work being done there. So you should do some of it too.
Thanks, Emily, again. And so a question from Joanne Hollows. Something you've built, just to build on what you've been talking about in the presentation, what is the relationship between dude food and dirty food? And have you seen evidence of dirty foods in more feminized diet media in the US? I'm thinking in relation to books like Pinch of Nom in the UK, which are written by women, but present dirty dishes for dieters.
Yeah, so I'm assuming you're talking about sort of this dichotomy of like clean eating, right? And then there's this opposite of like dirty food that maybe has that flavor profile, right, of this dude food. So there was an interesting cookbook in the United States called The Dude Diet that came from a blog, and then the blogger did 2 cookbooks. And so it's sort of more nutritionally moderate dude food. Like some of her recipes are really delicious. Like I don't critique what she did. But in thinking about that idea of dude still being attached to sort of the recipes that she's presenting. I think part of what I saw in the change of the salads into these wellness bowls is what I talk about in the book of this concept of zero. So for men, they couldn't just market diet, right? Diet was read as feminine. So they had to come up with an diet way to talk to men about diet sodas, about salads, about health, about yogurts. And so I argue that's through this concept of zero. So if diet for women is about lack and about restraint and about thinness, zero is about what it has, right? The value that it adds, what it is full of, how it is satisfying, and how it is helping you, right, be in control of your body and your appetite and meet your goals. So in this really ambivalent way, right, zero could be applied to sort of women's diet literature in a way that would be more feminist, right, more empowering, less detrimental, but it's still sort of tied up in this diet culture that I'm ultimately quite critical of and think all of us should be working to free ourselves from. But this clean, dirty dichotomy, this idea of the dude and how it's marketed differently still to men and women is a really interesting question. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you again, Emily. We've got around 6 minutes to go now. I'm just going to try and get through these few questions. So does the research...
I will do shorter responses, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Does your research, absolutely fantastic and very thorough, does your research on food and Instagram also consider the dude? And if so, how does this present itself?
Yes, so the dude's not in that book. I did write a little bit in the dude food section in this one, thinking about the different style, right, of sort of these side-based shots to show the girth and such. I also did a little bit of analysis looking at Pinterest, which is a social media platform that has a lot more women sort of followers, and thinking about how dude food there is presented in this much more feminized, nurturing lens, right? These are foods to make for Father's Day. These are foods to make to hold on to your man. Like it was this much more conventional sort of messaging that you'd see in like 1950s, 1960s cookbooks. So thinking about dude food in these different social media spaces, it circulates quite differently. But there is a little bit about Instagram in Diners, Dudes, and Diets and thinking about how it's represented and the kinds of hashtags, right? It's not just food porn, it's meat porn, right? Like burger porn, like these all sort of these derivatives of different hashtags that are being used in this space too.
Okay, brilliant. I think we've got time for another couple of questions. So firstly then, one that hasn't been covered. So Barbara Excellent talk. Thank you. I'm intrigued by this idea of post-gender unisex food advertising. Since Emily has said it's unfeminine, like no flowers, and the colour schemes in the example were on the grey black spectrum, I'm wondering if in this case unisex is just dialed down dude, and also ties in with the gender contamination arguments.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I read about in the conclusion, arguing that White Claw is kind of extending some of those dudish elements to a broader audience. And then what I do is I take each case study and see what happened after 2016. So where are these brands now? So Diet Coke, for example, attempted to extend the casual hang and to attach it to Diet Coke, right? That this was going to be the millennial beverage for both men and women. It wasn't a ladies' diet drink anymore. So they attempted. So some of the brands did try, right, to just sort of do dialed down dude for everyone as their strategy. Some start to not talk about gender at all. And then some like double down, like one of the yogurts became like even more regressive and misogynistic in what they were promoting. But I think you're onto something, that like this construction of the dude and who it's available to as a step in this effort to sort of have unisex, post-gender, more inclusive advertising, it retains those dudish elements. I'm so glad you picked up on that.
Brilliant. Again, thanks, Emily. Thank you for the questions, guys. So one final question on performing identity. Have you looked into virtue signaling and the performance of good and clean food by brands, but also within food media? I think you've touched on this already.
Yes. So I think in thinking about diet culture, like that clean, dirty dichotomy, like is just new language to still keep us in a diet culture mentality. So I find that deeply unhelpful as a direction of where we can go and how we think about our bodies and where we work. But this idea of virtue signaling, I think, goes a lot of different directions, right? In thinking about quality ingredients or sourcing or what stories are we telling. That I think it's a deeply ambivalent space of some things could really be working towards a more just, inclusive, accessible food system. But a lot of the times we see those messages being put forth, you know, by brands in the global north that have great resources, that hold on to a lot of that power. So I think that pushes us again to not just messaging and representation, but who makes up these industries, who has the opportunity to come up with the stories, tell the stories, get this out there. That call to really diversify these industries so they're truly inclusive is the big step that we really need to take.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you guys for the questions. We are happy to kind of continue this conversation offline. And Emily's been kind enough to kind of offer that as an opportunity. We haven't been able to get through all the questions, but it's been a real pleasure hosting this first session and introducing Emily, working with Julie and the BSA food team. And, you know, so it's been a real pleasure. I'm going to kind of hand over to Emily for any final comments and then back to Julie before we conclude.
No, just thank you so much, all of you, for having me. And I encourage you to come to other talks in the series. I think I'm excited for every single one of them. So honored to be a part of BSA's Food Studies group. Thank you so much. A great way to start the new year.
Thank you, Emily. That was really brilliant, and loads and loads of positive feedback, and everyone thoroughly enjoyed it. It's very enthusiastic and very engaging presentation, so thank you so much. And it's really got us all thinking and hungry, actually, because it's sort of nearly tea time here in the UK, so I'm feeling a bit hungry, but I don't think I'm going to be having a burger. But thank you ever so much, and for starting the seminar series. It's quite a hard act to follow, I would think. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming along and for your questions.